History as it happens, August 20th, 2024. No one votes for vice president.
We're effectively run in this country via the Democrats, via our corporate oligarchs, by a bunch of childless cat ladies who are miserable at their own lives and the choices that they've made, and so they want to make the rest of the country miserable too.
I happen to be the first union member on a presidential ticket since Ronald Reagan. But rest assured, I won't lose my way.
Every 4 years, we spend a lot of time speculating over and analyzing running mates. But Americans vote for the top of the ticket. Has a running mate ever made a difference on Election Day? Has there ever been a powerful or influential vice president? Or was John Adams right when he said it was the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived? That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
What you said, Martin, was more correct the farther back we go in our history. As we come closer to the present, as we're more of a video media age and now an age of memes, the image of the candidate is very much affected by, as Jeff says, the judgment they show and who they pick, but also who they're standing next to. And so I think it made an enormous difference that Barack Obama had a working class white Irish guy next to him when he was running for president. It made an enormous difference that John McCain had a soccer mom from Alaska who looked a little on edge, and it made him look different. And I think Tim Walz affects the way people view Kamala Harris. So the image, the portrait of the candidate is shaped by the person who's standing next to the candidate most often during the campaign, which is the vice president.
In an interview on CBS's Face the Nation a couple weeks back, Republican vice presidential nominee J.D. Vance was asked to respond to something Donald Trump said about running mates, that they rarely matter. And Vance answered candidly.
Well, I think President Trump's right about that, actually. I think most people were voting for Donald Trump or for Kamala Harris. Donald Trump delivered rising wages and a secure border. Kamala Harris has delivered an open border and falling wages relative to inflation and groceries and housing and so forth. So I think that he's actually right, that most people, when they cast their ballots, they're basing it based on who the presidential nominee is, not the vice presidential nominee.
Now, Vance has received a lot of attention since he was selected, in part for past comments about women's reproductive choices. His counterpart, Democrat Tim Walz, has also come under scrutiny for the way he handled the Black Lives Matter riots in Minneapolis in 2020, among other things, Walz being Minnesota's governor. For days and days, pundits speculated about whom Donald Trump and Kamala Harris would pick as their running mates. It got to the point where I couldn't take it anymore, because no one votes for vice president. Yet it seems the choice of running mate does matter for some reason. Past elections produced unforgettable moments, as when Dan Quayle got the "You're no Jack Kennedy" line from Lloyd Bentsen on the 1988 debate stage.
That was really uncalled for, Senator.
You're the one that was making the comparisons, Senator, and I'm one who knew him well. And frankly, I think you're so far apart in the objectives you choose for your country that I did not think the comparison was well taken.
Dan Quayle was exposed as, how shall we say, not ready for prime time, but that did not stop George Bush from trouncing Michael Dukakis at the top of the ticket. And who can forget Sarah Palin's astounding stupidity in 2008 when she was John McCain's running mate, in interview after interview?
They're our next door neighbors, and you can actually see Russia from land here in Alaska.
Well, explain to me why that enhances your foreign policy credentials.
Well, it certainly does. As Putin rears his head and comes into the airspace of the United States of America, where do they go? It's Alaska.
Do you agree with the Bush doctrine?
In what respect, Charlie?
The Bush, what do you interpret it to be?
His worldview.
But I'm not sure Palin made much of a difference either, despite her instant fame in an election year when Democrats were exhilarated by Barack Obama after 8 years of regrettable Republican rule. In other words, it may not have mattered at all who John McCain chose. Once in office, vice presidents have mattered quite a bit when the president has died. That's happened 8 times, and Vice President Ford took office after Richard Nixon resigned in 1974.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
And 6 vice presidents won a presidential election on their own merits, if you will. Joe Biden, the most recent one. Nixon was Eisenhower's veep for 8 years, and then after 8 years out of politics, ran for the White House and won in 1968. So it would be wrong to say the VP is always irrelevant. We just can't know for sure when it will matter. Which is why my only qualification for selecting a running mate is being ready to run the country if something happens to the chief executive. Think of, say, Harry Truman.
Over the White House at Washington, the flag flies at half-staff as a grief-stricken nation mourns the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States.
Now, Truman was a relative unknown. He wasn't very close to President Roosevelt, and within weeks of Inauguration Day in 1945, Truman was in the Oval Office with a world war on his hands. So we might say that we were lucky in that case, that Roosevelt selected someone who wasn't incompetent.
Only yesterday, we laid to rest the mortal remains of our beloved President, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. At a time like this, words are inadequate.
More now with Jeffrey Engel, founding director of the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University, and Jeremi Suri of the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. He is the host of This Is Democracy podcast and Democracy of Hope on Substack. Jeffrey Engel, welcome back.
It's good to see you.
It's not good to see you, but welcome back anyway. I feel obligated to have you on after all this time. Jeremi Suri, welcome back.
I'm glad we started with such a friendly attitude here. Right?
Well, you know,
I am happy to see both of you, so I want to just put that on the record.
I'm in a bad mood. I'm tired of all this talk about vice presidents. I'm just tired of politics. So, all together now, fellas. No one votes for vice president. I should put an echo effect on that. No one votes for vice president. Jeffrey Engel, what do you think?
Wrong. What the vice presidential decision does is it's the first essentially presidential decision for a candidate. The first time that they're making an executive decision, it sets the entire tone, I would argue, not only for their campaign, but for what they think their administration is going to be. So yes, nobody actually votes for the vice president, but the vice presidential pick, I think, is extraordinarily important for the subsequent campaign and for how people wind up evaluating the person at the top of the ticket.
So I'm not wrong, because you said no one votes for vice president. But I still disagree with the second part of your statement there because, well, I'll let Jeremi go.
I have 1,000 examples.
Okay,
we're
going to get into
Jeremi
these.
First.
Go ahead, Jeremi. Yeah, it's not that it's totally irrelevant. It's mostly irrelevant.
So I agree with Jeff. I think what you said, Martin, was more correct the farther back we go in our history. As we come closer to the present, as we're more of a video media age and now an age of memes, the image of the candidate is very much affected by, as Jeff says, the judgment they show and who they pick, but also who they're standing next to. And so I think it made an enormous difference that Barack Obama had a working class white Irish guy next to him when he was running for president. It made an enormous difference that John McCain had a soccer mom from Alaska who looked a little on edge, and it made him look different. And I think Tim Walz affects the way people view Kamala Harris. So the image, the portrait of the candidate is shaped by the person who's standing next to the candidate most often during the campaign, which is the vice president. And then there's Jeff's point about the judgment they show. And people think, okay, if the candidate chooses this kind of person to be vice president, they're going to choose a similar kind of person to be Secretary of State and Secretary of the Treasury. And that was a big problem for John McCain. That's motivated Kamala Harris to choose Tim Walz, and it was probably a bad decision by Donald Trump to choose J.D. Vance for what that told people as well.
It doesn't matter who Donald Trump picks because his personality dominates, overwhelms. He could have picked anybody that was being bandied about. It wouldn't have made a difference.
Yeah, but that's why Donald Trump is unhappy with his pick, at least thus far.
Was he happy with anybody?
We're talking about J.D. Vance before we're talking about Donald Trump. He doesn't want that.
And J.D. Vance looks like a stiff next to Trump. In fact, it's very hard for him to have a vice presidential running mate because, as you say, he soaks up all the oxygen. Mike Pence was perfect because he could be holier than thou and balance out the New York car salesman. Yeah. But now you've got the used car salesman and another used car salesman up there.
Has it ever made a difference in the final vote tally? Has it ever swung an election?
I think one could argue, I'm guessing Jeff would agree, that in the case of John F. Kennedy, having Lyndon Johnson on the ballot made a big difference in Texas, and that was a very close election in Texas and a very close election nationally.
You know, that is a good point. I'll concede that one because Kennedy chose Johnson for the balancing the ticket reason, which when I was growing up was always the reason you picked a vice president, or most of the time you picked a vice president. That's not the case now with the two that were chosen this year. We'll return to the present moment, but Engel, Professor Engel, do you agree with Mr. Suri over here that Johnson may have made the difference with Kennedy in 60?
I do. I think so. And again, it's really hard to pull these things apart. We're essentially asking, especially let's look at more recent elections. Let's look at 2016. How much did gender play a role there? How much did regionalism play a role there? And there's all kinds of factors that actually add up to a person's vote.
Yeah. Well, just sorry to interrupt. 2008, right? You guys mentioned Obama and I'm already forgetting who he chose. Oh, Biden. Yeah, the guy who's president now. That was such a bad year for Republicans. It wouldn't have mattered who President Obama or candidate Obama had chosen. That was a difficult year for Republicans. If Jesus Christ had come down from the heavens to run for the Republicans, it still may not have made a difference considering what George Bush was leaving the next guy.
Well, I mean, listen, we can get epistemological here and discuss your definition of the word difference. Yeah. Yes, I completely agree that 2008 was a likely year for Democrats. And they, of course, being Democrats, did the most difficult thing possible, which was nominate an African-American for the first time. But then Barack Obama, I don't think it's necessarily as important, though it is important, that he chose, working class white guy from Scranton. Remember, Obama's real problem in 2008 was that he had only been in Washington for 2 years himself, had just gotten to the Senate. So how do you rectify the fact that you look like you're younger than everybody else and that you clearly have less Washington experience? Let's bring in the most experienced Washington hand we can find. Even then, back in 2008, Joe Biden was an old wise man of Washington. I think it actually does a really nice job of showing, much to be honest, like Dick Cheney's selection by George W. Bush, when you have a very young, out of Washington, inexperienced candidate, no matter how exciting he or she may be, people still want to know that there's some experience in the room. And again, it doesn't mean that the president's necessarily going to listen to the vice president. It doesn't mean that anybody's going to vote for the vice president, but it does give the image that this person is interested in stability. This person's interested in experience. So yes, I think 2008 was a Democratic setup well for the Democrats, but I think Joe Biden was also an inspired choice by that particular candidate.
I would say the same about 2016 with Trump and Pence. I think Mike Pence really helped elect Donald Trump in 2016. I think Mike Pence now regrets it. But I remember so many Republicans saying, yes, Trump he doesn't fit our mold of a Christian conservative, but he's going to have a Christian conservative a heartbeat away from the presidency. And once he's in office, they were expecting Pence to play a role similar to Cheney's. Of course, that's not what happened. But I do think with religious conservatives, Pence made a big difference. And I think that's a challenge for Trump now, not having Pence on the ticket.
Can I throw one more example at you? It's a lesser known vice presidential example, only in the sense that it's a lesser vice president in many ways. But George H.W. Bush's selection of Dan Quayle. Dan Quayle obviously became a late night punchline for some of his malapropisms. But we should remember that the biggest critique against Bush, the thing that ultimately destroyed his presidency, I would argue, is that people who are genuine conservatives, movement conservatives, Reagan conservatives, didn't think Bush was one of them. Remember, Newt Gingrich is actually the guy, his own party mate, that does in, I would argue, the Bush candidacy by making him essentially fight and have to work with Democrats to pass a reasonable budget, thereby opening up, again, the no new taxes critique. All of which is to say, one thing that Bush wanted to do in '88 was to shore up his conservative credentials. And Dan Quayle basically comes from the same part of the Indiana profile, if you will, as Mike Pence.
But Quayle was terrible. He was embarrassing. He was clearly not ready to be president. And to me, that's the only qualification there is when you're picking somebody to be your vice presidential running mate. Is this
no,
person...
you just no, I'm sorry, Martin, but you just changed the equation on in that one sentence. You said that he wasn't ready to be vice president, so he was a bad choice. We were talking about electability for the man or woman at the top of the ticket.
Yeah, people
and
still
Dan Quayle
vote.
did an extremely good thing getting enough conservatives to the polls for H.W. Bush to win. Now, that has nothing whatsoever to do with his qualification as president. Yeah. It's about his what he brings to the ballot.
The way I would talk about it, Martin, just to kind of synthesize these, is it's part of the narrative of who the president is. None of us would say that the vice president is the main part of the narrative, even the main subplot. But it is one of the subplots that is part of the narrative of who this person is. Now, we see the limits of how much a vice president can help when you had Dukakis and Lloyd Bentsen. Lloyd Bentsen was highly regarded, and many people thought Lloyd Bentsen should have been president, but that was not good enough to help Dukakis in 1988.
It is not just age, it's accomplishments, it's experience. I have far more experience than many others that sought the office of vice president of this country. I have as much experience in the Congress as Jack Kennedy did when he sought the presidency. I will be prepared to deal with the people in the Bush administration if that unfortunate event would ever occur.
Senator Benson?
Senator, I served with Jack Kennedy. I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy.
But I do think Jeff is right. I do remember all of a sudden it was a big deal that George H.W. Bush chose someone from what was seen as the far right of the party at the time. He was basically saying to the far right of the party, I'm one of you. And it brought Bill Kristol and all these individuals into that orbit. And that became part of the narrative. And it became harder to say, as Gingrich had been saying, Bush is not a real conservative.
That's interesting. I've never thought about Quayle in that light. I always thought that he hurt Bush because he was so embarrassing. And he was not ready to be president, which, as I mentioned, should be the only qualification or the most important qualification for picking somebody. We're going to go now to the origins of the office and work our way back up to present time. The vice presidency, constitutionally, we're going back to the 18th century now. It is a powerless office. The person does not make policy. More recently, they've been given portfolios to work on issues and such, but vice presidents don't have power. They've often just simply been ignored, but they had two roles, if you will, break ties in the Senate and be there if something happens to the president. Is that basically it, if we go back to the origins?
I think so. In fact, I like to joke that it's not just breaking ties with the Senate. They have a very critical job, which is every day asking the president, hey, how you feeling?
I've written a bit about this recently for Foreign Policy and elsewhere. I mean, I think that vice presidents are almost always unhappy because they tend to be powerful people. John Nance Garner is the best example of this, right? I mean, this is the man who's the Speaker of the House. You know, he controls Congress and he goes on to become FDR's vice president, and no one listens to him anymore. He doesn't matter. Lyndon Johnson had the same experience. John F. Kennedy sent him to Vietnam in 1961 just to get him out of Washington. One didn't really care what Johnson thought about Vietnam. So presidents matter more actually in the election than they do once their president gets elected. Then they're kind of furniture in the room.
You meant vice presidential picks matter more.
Vice president, vice president.
In fact, the first time that we have the occasion of a vice president becoming president upon the death of the president is after William Henry Harrison passes away. John Tyler, the vice president, wasn't even in Washington because why would he be? There's nothing for him to do.
His accidency was his nickname.
Exactly.
So unpopular with his own party that they went another direction when the election came around. Yeah, I guess I should be careful here. We're talking about two different things. Vice presidential picks and whether anyone actually votes for them in November. My position is people vote for the top of the ticket. They do not vote for vice president. And then once you're in office, what does this office mean, the vice presidency? It's not totally irrelevant. I would say it's mostly irrelevant. Obviously, it's very relevant if something happens to the president. John Adams, he thought the office was useless, right?
Right. Right. Yeah, no, he was very unhappy. He's the first of many unhappy vice presidents. That was also a strange moment. At that time, the vice president, and this is until we get into the 19th century, right, and the 12th Amendment, the vice president is the person who's supposed to be the one who came in second. And, in the case of Adams and Jefferson, you have your rival. So, of course, you intentionally keep them out of everything.
Yeah, I just did an episode, The Election of 1800. Burr and Jefferson tied because somebody screwed up there. They didn't cast an electoral college vote for a stray candidate, so it had to go to the House of Representatives. But yeah, Jefferson was John Adams' vice president because he came in second in 1796. Vice presidency as a dead-end job. When Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, was not chosen, I was like, well, that's good for him. He wants to run for the top job at some point because it can end up as a dead-end job. But pun intended, there have been a number of times, as we all know, when a vice president became president because the president died. 8 times that has happened. And then Gerald Ford became president when Nixon resigned. 6 vice presidents were elected on their own. I am bouncing around the timeline here. People who have run for vice president and have lost, their careers have pretty much gone nowhere recently.
I wouldn't say their careers have gone nowhere. I would say that it actually opens them up as a future candidate, and then they've subsequently derailed their own candidacy. So Sarah Palin, to go back to 2008, whom nobody on the national stage knew, which was one of the reasons that McCain picked her. It was a maverick move, bring in this person who's a different generation, the person from a different part of the country, different mindset, different gender, obviously. Here is this candidate who came out of nowhere, did not particularly do well with the general populace during the general election, but actually, again, did quite well with conservative voters. She became a national figure immediately. That was a big step up for her. Same with Paul Ryan, when he was the vice presidential candidate 2012 for
Romney.
Mitt Romney. He subsequently did not become president, but he certainly remained an important national figure for subsequent years. So if you're the young person on the ticket and you lose, you at least are in the conversation going forward. Same with Dan Quayle, who considered future politics as well.
He ran for president, yeah.
It didn't work out, but he can certainly, that person is certainly in a good position to say, yeah, we lost, but it's the other guy's fault. And I'll give you the best example of this overall. Remember the 1920 election, as we all do. Yeah. James Cox of Ohio was at the top of the Democratic ticket, had a young whippersnapper next to him as the vice president, a man named Franklin Roosevelt. He loses the election, and I think we heard from Franklin Roosevelt again.
Roosevelt knew that there would have to be an economic downturn for Democrats to eventually return to the White House, because those are the years of Republican dominance, except for Woodrow Wilson's couple of terms. But Jeremi, maybe dead-end job was too strong a term, but if you run for vice president and lose, it's certainly not a ramp toward eventually becoming president.
Well, and I think this is a general rule of American politics. There are exceptions, but generally, if you lose, it's hard to come back. Americans don't like losers. And so FDR is, in some sense, an exception. And he was warned in 1920 not to be on the ticket, just as Kennedy considered running as vice president with Adlai Stevenson in 1956 and was warned off of that by his father. So generally, if you run a national campaign and you don't win, that's held against you. It's not interminably the end of your career, but you would probably, if you had a choice of running as vice president and losing or not running as vice president when the ticket loses, you would not run as vice president.
And even running for the top spot, Nixon lost in 1960. Then he lost the race for governor of California, right?
California.
And he retired from politics, and then he becomes president a few years later. So Abraham Lincoln.
Can we stick on Nixon for a second?
Yeah.
Remember that Nixon, of course, wanted to be Eisenhower's successor. He was the young man to Eisenhower's old, experienced hidden hand. And remember, he was running as the person who was a foreign policy guru and advisor for Eisenhower. And so you can imagine his campaign's reaction when about 6 weeks before the election, Eisenhower was giving a press conference and a reporter says, Mr. President, the vice president keeps saying that he was very, very influential in all of your foreign policy decisions. Can you give us an example? And Eisenhower pauses and says, well, if you give me a couple of weeks, I might be able to come up with one. tells you everything you need to know about what Eisenhower really thought about Nixon. And I would argue that quip was just as important as picking Lyndon Johnson to why John Kennedy won the election, because anybody who thought that they should vote for Nixon because Ike thought it was a good idea no longer thought that.
And Nixon never forgot that.
Nope.
He refers to it time and again. I mean, he felt that was one more example of the establishment kicking him in the rear end.
So you guys mentioned LBJ and Kennedy, LBJ helping out with the South, Kennedy being a Northern Democrat. Any other instances where a vice president made the difference? I don't think so. Obviously, Quayle didn't, because Bush was going to beat Dukakis. I mean, Dukakis was a hapless candidate. Palin, well, they lost. I don't know if you can blame that on Palin. We've already been over that.
I think that George H.W. Bush helped Ronald Reagan. Reagan probably would have won anyway. Reagan was seen as such a wild card. He was seen, I mean, it's funny because now in retrospect, in comparison to Trump, he seems so tame and so serious. But he was seen, especially by a lot of moderate Americans, he was seen as a little crazy and off the reservation. And George H.W. Bush, even in 1980, was seen as too boring and part of the establishment. And so putting him on the ticket, I think, made a big difference. And I think Reagan understood that, because Reagan initially went to Gerald Ford. And there was the effort to first get Gerald Ford on the ticket. He was looking for a Ford or a Bush, a mainstream trusted figure to balance out what was seen as his perhaps extremism on certain issues.
Yeah, Reagan had a lot of missteps when he was well ahead in the polls in 1980. He said some things that were quite bizarre, as you mentioned, Jeremi, Suri.
And I would think we need to talk about the subsequent election in 92. Bill Clinton was in a very enviable position given the recession, given the fact that there have been 3 Republican administrations in a row, or 3 elections in a row. But he, I think, really made a smart choice in doubling down on picking someone who didn't balance the ticket. What was Bill Clinton? He was a young Southern governor. Who'd they pick to go with him? A young Southern politician, Al Gore. And the whole message there was that we are generational change and we are going to be policy thinkers. And I think that that was an extremely important move for setting up what the entire tone of that election would be about thinking about tomorrow. So again, did it make the difference? I don't know if he would have lost with a different vice president, but it certainly set the right message and set the right direction for the campaign.
You know, you never want the vice president's personality to overshadow the top of the ticket. Gore was not Mr. Personality himself, okay? He wasn't going to, host any late night comedy shows. Clinton had a ton of charisma and political ability, so Gore, I guess, was the complement to that. He was a little bit boring, but that is an issue with the vice presidency and why it's so hard for vice presidents to become presidents on their own. Just the nature of the office, right? You're overshadowed by the boss. It's not your policies because you have no power. You don't make policy.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I can't help but say much of what you argue is correct, Martin, but the vice president can really hurt you if they overshadow you or if they embarrass you. And that is where I think Quayle was a liability in George H.W. Bush's reelection effort. Most of the things that Quayle did that were so embarrassing happened when he was vice president, when he was already in office.
It was an obscene period in our nation's history. No, not our nation's, but in World War II. I mean, we all lived in this century. I didn't live in this century, but in this century's history.
And I'm thinking in 1992 when Ross Perot chose James Stockdale, who gave, I would have said, the most embarrassing debate performance in history. Now it's it's a competition. But his coming into a debate and saying, "Why am I here?
Who am I? Why am I here?"
That became the story, which took away from all of Perot's efforts to put the agenda on deficit reduction and things of that sort.
Yeah, Stockdale was kind of poking fun at himself, and then he lost his train of thought badly during that answer. He paused for a long time, put his eyeglasses back on.
The centerpiece of my life was the Vietnam War. I was there the day it started. I led the first bombing raid against North Vietnam. I was there the day it ended, and I was there for everything in between. 10 years in Vietnam, aerial combat, and torture. I know things about the Vietnam War better than anybody in the world. I know some things about the Vietnam War better than anybody in the world. And I know how governments, how American governments can be courageous and how they can be callow. And that's important. That's one thing I'm an insider on.
He seemed out of it, like he had lost his bearings, because he wasn't a politician, and it wasn't really probably fair to him to put him on that stage.
No, in fact, I know that story, actually. It's actually very interesting. He was, friends with Ross Perot. As you remember, Stockdale was Admiral Stockdale. He had spent his career in the Navy. He had flown fighter jets in Vietnam. Then he became, a classics professor at Stanford, so he couldn't find a good place to teach, I guess. And consequently, he was put on the ticket by Ross Perot initially because several of the states that he wanted to get on the ballot required you to run with a vice president. And they said, well, how about Stockdale? Stockdale's a good guy. He'll say yes. Nobody thought he was actually going to be the vice presidential pick until the train went down the road. And finally, Ross Perot said, well, Admiral Stockdale's already there, and we all know he'd be a good president. He was not, to your point, Martin, not in any way, shape, or form set up to run a national political campaign. May have been a wonderful president, certainly was a brave and smart man, but that doesn't mean you do well in the Kliegelites of the election.
When I look at the picks or the nominees, is this person ready to be the president of the United States should something tragic happen to the president? Dan Quayle, of course not. Stockdale, of course not. But I didn't really think Ross Perot was fit to be president of the United States. Maybe you guys disagree with me there. So, the memification of our politics today, to me, J.D. Vance, all this stuff aside about some of his bizarre comments about women in the past, I see somebody who's only been in the Senate for a couple of years. Is he ready to be president of the United States? Should something happen to Donald Trump if Trump wins in November? I would say no. But people have surprised us in the past, right? So I want to talk about Truman in that vein.
Yes.
This is a long question, but I actually was going to bring up Abraham Lincoln before when Jeffrey interrupted me, which is totally fine. This is a free-flowing conversation here, gentlemen. Lincoln had Hannibal Hamlin was his first term vice president. How did Andrew Johnson become Abraham Lincoln's vice president for the second term? Jeremy, why don't you take this on? You just wrote a book about this period.
Yeah, and I actually wrote about exactly this. Andrew Johnson was chosen because Lincoln wanted to run in 1864 as a national unity candidate. He didn't even want to be called a Republican. He wanted to argue that he was prosecuting the war to protect the Union, and he was the unity candidate. And so he wanted someone who had some kind of legitimacy with some Southern voters. Andrew Johnson was the only Southern senator who had not left the Senate at the time of secession. And that was because Andrew Johnson saw Andrew Jackson as his hero. Andrew Jackson had been a supporter of slavery. They were both from Tennessee, but Andrew Jackson was a staunch Unionist as well. And so Lincoln chose Johnson instead of Hamlin because he wanted to say, this is a national unity ticket. Look, I have a Southerner on the ticket. He never intended for Johnson to have any role in his administration, and Johnson never intended to have any role in his administration.
I'm bringing it up because talk about a consequential decision. And this is where the vice president does matter. Andrew Johnson, arguably the worst president in American history.
Yeah, I think so. I think
I said arguably.
Arguably. Okay, I'll grant arguably.
The bad things Andrew Johnson did were more consequential than some of the bad things others tried to do. So you could argue there were others who may have tried to do even worse. Andrew Johnson single-handedly undermines many of the main thrusts of Reconstruction by simply not enforcing the law.
He was a ferocious white supremacist as well.
Absolutely.
So John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, they are vice presidents who become president. Martin Van Buren ran after being Jackson's second-term vice president. Teddy Roosevelt, he wins the White House on his own, but he had been president for basically 3 years plus when McKinley was assassinated. Coolidge, he wins one of his own terms, could have kept running. But again, he also, first time around, took over for Warren Harding, who had died. Harry Truman, all right, we're going to get to Truman now. He's next in this line. Did Harry Truman know Roosevelt was dying?
Yes. Everybody in America knew Roosevelt was dying. Everybody in the Democratic Party in particular knew Roosevelt was dying. The DNC at the time, or the functional equivalent thereof, actually made Roosevelt go and see an independent doctor. And that independent doctor reported back, there's no way that this man is going to live throughout the year, let alone another 4.
Did that info get out to the public?
No, but you didn't. He didn't look good. I mean, in the same way that, it's actually, well, one is tempted to make an analogy to President Biden, but I think it's actually much worse because Roosevelt, I think, was delusional if he thought that he was going to live another 4 years, which makes it all the more fascinating. Not only that they brought in somebody who was relatively unknown on a national scene. He was a senator. He was an important senator in terms of his investigations, but did not have a full national profile. He was known, if nothing else, for being a loyal Democrat. In fact, for being loyal to whoever had bought him first. Consequently, he was also, therefore, considered to be good for the Southern Democratic Party on civil rights, which is to say he was against it, they thought. All the more fascinating that Roosevelt didn't spend any time with him before he died.
They didn't really know each other, right?
No. So Truman shows up as basically a novice who is also basically a political unknown, whose views, by the way, are different than what many people suspect. Talk about a stressful moment.
Our departed leader never looked backward. He looked forward and moved forward. That is what he would want us to do. That is what America will do.
Jeremi, Suri, why did Roosevelt dump Henry Wallace? So you mentioned this before, his first vice president was Nance. No, that was his middle
John
name.
Nance Garner.
Nance Garner.
Cactus Jack, as he was known, from Uvalde, of all places, Uvalde, Texas.
Who said the office of the vice presidency was worth less than a bucket of warm piss. He was right. So then Henry Wallace, who was a far left Democrat, some people even thought he was a communist of a sort. He's FDR's second vice president.
Mm-hmm.
So why does Roosevelt dump Wallace and go with Truman? Again, hugely consequential decision.
Because Wallace was seen as too radical. Wallace was seen, just as you said, he had been attacked by Republicans and by others as being too radical. He had been Secretary of Agriculture before, and he had proposed many policies that some thought were socialist-like policies. FDR liked him because he had strong agrarian roots, and he was a hard worker, and he had a lot of policy knowledge. But his views, the more people saw them, they became more controversial. And so FDR was under enormous pressure. And because his health was not great, and because this was going to be a 4th term, which was beyond now 2 terms beyond the Washington rule, he had to compromise with the party. I mean, even an all-powerful president has to compromise with his party. Dumping Wallace was essential. Roosevelt wanted to make Jimmy Burns his vice presidential running mate, Jimmy Burns, who had been a Supreme Court justice and then the head of the Office of War Production, the guy who really ran the war at home for Roosevelt. FDR really wanted to make him vice president. FDR really thought he was the person who was best prepared to be president next. The problem was that Jimmy Burns was an arch segregationist, and not just that, he was incredibly vocal in his racism. And that alienated Northern Democrats, and it alienated African Americans and others who were part of this new coalition. Roosevelt brings African Americans from the Republican Party into the Democratic Party. Burns would have sent them back to the Republican Party. So he comes upon Truman, as Jeff described very well, as a kind of compromise candidate who no one's really for, but no one's really against. And so the dark horse is the choice to make.
One must wonder what was going through Truman's head. First, he finds out about the Manhattan Project after Roosevelt dies. That's simply amazing. I can't get my mind wrapped around that, no matter how many times I think of it, that it was such a secret the vice president didn't know about it. And he's got to manage the end of World War II. And in his first speech to Congress, Truman reinforced the fact that it would be unconditional surrender.
That America will continue the fight for freedom until no vestige of resistance remains.
Can I thread a needle real quick on Truman's not knowing? Because it's true, he did not know the details of the Manhattan Project. There's a wonderful memo, which you can find just by Googling it. I show my students every semester, from Henry Stimson, who was the Secretary of War. After Roosevelt dies, writes a memo saying, "Mr. President, you and I need to talk about something." And it takes almost a week for them to get together, by the way, to talk about this. But Harry Truman, remember, had been up until 1944 head of the Truman Commission in the Senate. Was it bicameral? I'm not sure, actually, now I think about it. But it was a congressional investigative committee to oversight spending on the war, which means Harry Truman knew there's a whole lot of money going someplace. And he was, very loyal during the war. And he basically said, I understand when George Marshall tells me, Senator Truman, you have to trust me on this one. Just don't look in this one. Like, this is the one we don't want you to look at. Look at everything else, but not this. It's really important. He said, okay. So Truman knew that there was a lot of something going on, just didn't know the specifics of what it was.
Yeah, I didn't know that story. Schuyler Colfax, Henry Wilson, William Wheeler, Thomas Hendricks, Levi Morton, Garrett Hobart, Charles W. Fairbanks, James Sherman, Thomas Marshall, Charles Dawes of the Dawes Plan, Charles Curtis. Those are all vice presidents of the United States in the 19th and 20th centuries that no one knows these people's names. I have another list here of people who ran for vice president and lost. I haven't heard of most of these people. So I mentioned early in this wonderful conversation of ours, fellas, that in recent times, vice presidents have been given portfolios, more to do. We know that Kamala Harris was given the responsibility of dealing with immigration. She had to deal with Central American governments to try to stem the flow of immigrants from their countries to the United States. I'm sure she's really happy about having been given that responsibility now. But anyway, Dick Cheney, he was considered the most influential or powerful vice president ever because of the perceived influence of Cheney during the global war on terror. Now, I've said multiple times ad nauseum here, vice presidents don't have power, they don't make policy. What about Cheney? Was it different with him, Jeffrey Engel?
I think you used the word quite rightly, that he was perceived to be the most powerful vice president. This is still open to historical dispute, I think, and we don't have all the records yet. Now, he was certainly influential, much more so than most, if not all, 19th century vice presidents, for example. He was in the room, in the briefings, in the National Security Council meetings, et cetera, et cetera. Ultimately, the decision, as you pointed out, was George W. Bush's as the president. And by the second term in particular, Bush was basically openly mocking Cheney for his hawkish views in national security meetings and embarrassing Cheney because he had run out his patience with Cheney. So by the second term, he's not influential at all. But in the first term, I think you can make a really good case that he certainly had the appearance of being an extraordinarily important power broker. The historical record, some biographies have come out recently that suggest that Bush was more independent of Cheney than we thought at the time. But nonetheless, if you had to start ranking influential vice presidents, it's a very short list. So you would have to include Cheney at some point.
I would say Cheney was a unique vice president, not only because of the moment and because of who George W. Bush was, but he had so much experience working the executive bureaucracy. Most people who become vice president, as we've talked about, are senators or governors and people who are looking to boost themselves into running for president. I don't think Dick Cheney became vice president because he wanted to then run for president. He became vice president because he believed he understood, having been Ford's chief of staff and having been Secretary of Defense for George H.W. Bush, that he understood how the executive branch worked and that he could work it to his benefit and to the president's benefit. And that's what he did. He's one of the craftiest vice presidents I think we've had in using his position to create power for himself that he would not normally have had. He expanded the office of the vice president and put his people into meetings and into decision-making places where, quite frankly, they had no business being, but the president didn't prohibit them from being there. So,
in fact, a small point about Cheney that just reinforces what you just said, Jeremy, that I don't think most people realize. Cheney was one of the original enthusiasts. It wasn't his idea, but he was an enthusiastic supporter of what we now call the unitary executive theory, the idea that the president basically can do everything and should do everything and should not be constrained in any way, shape, or form. Cheney was making that argument when he was in Congress in the late 70s, early 80s, basically thinking about the idea of a congressman saying, I think we should give the president more power. That tells you really what he thinks.
Yeah. You've both read Melvin Loeffler's book, right, about the decision-making that led to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. You've both read that book, right? So the idea that Cheney was the most important decision maker or was involved in the falsification of intelligence that led to the war. I mean, Jeremy, I think you actually gave some really good examples about how he was influential. But I think Loeffler's book undermines some of the more out there arguments about Cheney's influence.
Yeah. I think it's silly to say that Cheney was running the White House. That's wrong. But it is important to say that Cheney was more of a player and an influencer on decisions than probably any vice president at any time. I mean, he takes on a role similar to what Henry Kissinger was doing in Nixon's White House. Nixon was still president, but Kissinger was making a lot of the key day-to-day decisions or influencing them, and I think Cheney was doing that as well. But they were Bush's decisions in the end. I think that's right.
Well, especially when you remember that Cheney was longtime best friends with Donald Rumsfeld.
Yeah.
Which means Rumsfeld, who, listen, every oral history I've ever done, and we do a bunch of them here at our center, of the George W. Bush administration, points out that Rumsfeld was uniquely problematic in policymaking circles. Let's put it that way. His best buddy was the vice president, who was a powerful vice president. So that helped him immeasurably.
Extraordinary moment that's worth commenting on, right? So on 9/11, when the planes hit the towers and there's concern that there might be another plane, it's Dick Cheney, it's the vice president who authorizes American military aircraft to shoot down a civilian plane. I've read the Constitution. There's no authority for the vice president to do that. The president was still alive. And that just gives you a sense. But no one questioned that. Wow. He was in the White House Situation Room, or the bunker, actually, I guess, at the time.
Bunker.
He gave the order. Condoleezza Rice, as NSC advisor, took the order, passed it on. There's no other vice president I know of who's ever come close to exerting that much power in that kind of moment.
That's amazing. Yeah, there is no constitutional basis for that. No vice president's ever had to make a policy decision ever, or any kind of decision, because they don't have any authority. That is amazing. You mentioned Kissinger before, national security advisor to Nixon. More powerful, or at least he was jockeying for influence in the administration over Melvin Laird, who was a Secretary of Defense. Spiro Agnew was a non-entity in Nixon's administration. He was the vice president, again, to my point about the irrelevancy of this office. But I do have an interview coming up with Carolyn Eisenberg about Nixon and Kissinger with her amazing book. Fire and Rain is the title of the book.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. She loves them. She loves Nixon and Kissinger.
Yes. Well, she's a remarkable scholar. She used to be an anti-war activist all those years
she's great.
ago.
It's a great book.
But you see, even there, Kissinger, with all of his influence, Nixon was still the decider. The president is the decider. So, yeah. Well, I guess I'm out of questions when it comes to vice president. So, I don't know. I guess that's the end of the podcast.
I think it's worthwhile reflecting upon what we've seen just in the first couple of weeks of Kamala Harris's candidacy for president, because she may actually be, a couple weeks in, may actually be a model for how we describe vice presidents in the future. Because the main critique against her as vice president was that she didn't really take any interesting stands on anything. Well, some might say that's exactly what the vice president's supposed to do. And then when she got her opportunity to use her own voice, it turned out she had opinions. It turned out she had a style. And it turned out that she had a vision. None of that was apparent 6 weeks ago. And I think that really just demonstrates, again, the conundrum of the vice president, that a really good vice president is capable of putting their personality in a box and putting the box away.
She's still working on policy points and getting her vision out there. But go ahead, Jeremy. Yeah.
I think both of those things are right. But I think this is also really unique, and it shows us why it's hard to run as vice president, because she's the exception. She's running against another incumbent president. So she's the vice president running against someone who was president. And so she can be the change candidate. Generally, the problem that a George H.W. Bush, a Mike Pence, an Al Gore have is when they are running after 2 terms, people are, even those who like the current president, they're tired. They want something different. And it's hard to run as Al Gore, as George H.W. Bush, and say, yes, you love the guy before me. I'm not as good as him, but I'm going to somehow do something else that's different and exciting. It's very hard to make that case. Kamala Harris can make that case because she's not running against a change candidate. She's actually running against someone who's saying life was great when he was president. I don't know how he came to that conclusion, but life was great when he was president. We should all go back to that and look at what her motto is that's caught on. And it's very powerful, right? We're not going back. So she can run as someone who has experience, but still is a change candidate.
That's
and I think it's
remarkable.
hard to imagine another vice president doing that in different circumstances.
It is an extraordinary set of circumstances here, and that's a great point. She's running as the change candidate. I mean, the contrast, she doesn't have to say anything. It's evident when you look at the TV. She succeeded an 81-year-old man who was disintegrating, had lost his marbles, another way of putting it.
Which one of the two are you talking about this?
Joe Biden. Donald Trump, actually, he is old, but
He's only 78.
his problems are different than Biden's. He's unhinged, whereas Biden just disintegrating. Age comes for us all. All right, we're going to wrap up with this. We're going to stump everybody here, including myself. I have to preface these questions by admitting I've never heard of these people either. All right, 1928, Al Smith, the Democrat, runs against Herbert Hoover and loses. Who is Al Smith's running mate?
Okay.
Be creative.
Both Jeremy and I passed our comps a long time ago.
Joseph T. Robinson.
Nope. Sorry.
Sorry.
Who is Herbert Hoover's vice president who would lose to Roosevelt?
Andrew Mellon, right?
No.
Oh, no, Mellon was Secretary of the Treasury.
Charles Curtis.
Charles Curtis. Okay.
Alf Landon lost to Roosevelt in 36. Who is Alf Landon's running mate?
Come on.
Frank Knox. Wendell Willkie lost to Roosevelt in 1940. His running mate, Charles L. McNary. Thomas Dewey ran for president twice in 44 and 48. You remember who his running mate? This is scintillating, isn't it? John Bricker and Earl Warren.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I think we all have heard of
History
Earl
might
Warren.
have changed.
Adlai Stevenson ran for president twice. Lost to Eisenhower both times. His first running mate, John Sparkman, who died in 1985, and Estes Kefauver.
Yeah, as the Kefauver.
All right. So,
and to your point, by the way, Kefauver tried to get the Democratic nomination to be president in 1960, and as a losing vice president, that didn't work. Obviously.
yeah, it's not a great career path.
I have a funny vice presidential story.
One more. I'll stump you with one more, then I'll hear it, Jeffrey. William Miller. He was Goldwater's running mate. I have never heard of Bill Miller before.
We had a great colleague in graduate school brilliant historian, brilliant guy, who our first year, I think, thought it would be a useful bar trick to impress women by saying that he could say all the vice presidents in order. I remember being very impressed that he could do this. I remember being very impressed that this was not a good tactic.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, 50 years ago this August 8th, 1974 to be exact, President Richard Nixon resigned. We think of Watergate, the break-in, and the cover-up. But there are equally, if not more important aspects of Nixon's legacy, his lawlessness when it came to prosecuting the war in Southeast Asia. And that has important implications for America's sprawling security commitments. The imperial presidency, our forever wars today. That's next with Carolyn Eisenberg, winner of the Bancroft Prize for her book, Fire and Rain, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.